Welcome back to One Piece Explained. Chapter 1116 continues with Vegapunk's message, and in this breakdown, I'll be talking about just when Vegapunk had hid the transponder snail in the Iron Giant, how he may have known about the world government's plans ahead of time, and what it means that the Roger Pirates are now being focused on once again, plus much more. And I want to get into it right away, so if you end up enjoying this video, be sure to like and subscribe. So with that said, let's get into Chapter 1116, Inner Conflict. We get our 6th entry in Yamato's cover story this week, and along with it are the return of some more characters from Wano. Osuru is in the spotlight here, gifting Yamato some food and supplies for the journey. Last we saw her, she was speaking with Ochocho about returning to the flower capital at the end of the Wano arc. Back then, the left side of her face was bandaged up after Okobore town was burned down, and we see she has been left with a burn scar here. In the background is also Urashima, a Yokozuna from the flower capital. We actually haven't seen him since Act 1 of Wano, when Luffy defeated him in a sumo match. His hair seems to have grown back just a little bit after Kiku had cut his top knot off. And all the way to the left is Osome with Chuji in hand. Osome was the geisha whom Sanji saved from Queen, with Chuji being her pet mouse. We haven't seen her since Sanji had helped her escape from the flooding of Onigashima, but in the anime she was given an extended sequence with Sanji afterwards before the Straw Hats left. This cover story is already paying off and doing what we had hoped, with revisiting some of the characters from Wano that we never really got to spend too much time with after the raid, so I'm looking forward to this continuing. As for the chapter itself, we continue around the world much like we have for the past several chapters, and we start off in Alabasta, more specifically Yuba, as evidenced by the text on the visual transponder snail. We had last seen this place in the Decks of the World cover story during the Fishman Island arc after Koza and his father had restored the Oasis town. This looks to be Koza to the left here, with who I imagine is Toto in the front. Over to the right looks to be some of the other former members of the rebel army, with Eric here in the hat. In the Decks of the World cover story, he was depicted with dark hair, but this may have been an oversight since his original appearance has always featured lighter hair. And in front of him may perhaps be Falafra. Toward the center may be Kappa, who was the young boy who discovered Baroque works impersonating King Cobra, but it's a bit hard to tell. Though besides him is a Campbell that may be Eyelashes, who we also haven't seen since the Decks of the World cover story. In Mary Joie in the Chamber of Flowers, Imu gazes upon a large painting of what I can only imagine to be Lily, who looks nearly identical to Vivi. As we know, the women of the Nefeltari family do resemble each other quite a bit, as we had seen with Vivi's mother, Titi. If this is indeed Lily, then this is our first glimpse at her since the silhouette earlier in this arc during the flashback to the Reverie. There are a lot of theories surrounding Imu's true appearance, and at this point, I believe it's hard to say anything for certain, though I have always been fond of the idea that Imu may actually be inhabiting Lily's body, but I also like the idea that Imu is purely a silhouette just as well, so we'll have to see. It's a bit unclear who ends up shouting Vegapunk's name in this sequence, whether it's Imu or not, though I tend to lean toward it being the people of Alabasta. We then cut over to Alabarna, the capital, and find Igaram saddened over a stack of missing posters of Vivi. We had last seen him earlier in this arc during that Reverie flashback, as he was asking around if anyone had seen her. Behind him is Karoo, who is also weeping. We actually haven't seen him since when we initially got to see the Reverie in real time over 200 chapters ago, and it's been a bit of a mystery where he ended up since he wasn't with Vivi since then, so it's good to know that he's safe at the very least. Then we move over to the tomb of the royal family, where we find the royal guards of Alabasta paying respects to the late King Cobra. Now we did see this tomb back during the Alabasta arc, and just behind these doors here is where the chamber containing the poneglyph was. This whole place was supposedly destroyed after Cobra triggered its collapse when Crocodile arrived back then, though it seems to have been restored since then. The sarcophagus in the middle was always there even back during the Alabasta arc, so it's hard to say if they were able to retrieve Cobra's body and lay it to rest or not. Of course, we also see Chaka and Pell looking up at Cobra's painting. We last saw them during the flashback to the Reverie earlier in this arc as well, as they were looking for Cobra and Vivi. We later check in on the Revolutionary Army at the Kamabaka Queendom, where we find some of the other members tuning into the broadcast. We of course have the 3 vice captains, Ushiano, Ahiru, and Jiron, and in the center is Bunkov, one of the new Kama from Impel Down. We had last seen them earlier in this arc during the previous day, when Saba returned to tell Dragon and Ivankov about his mission report. Behind Jiron is another character who looks incredibly familiar, though I can't quite place them here. I believe we last saw them during the Reverie arc when the island was preparing for the meeting of the Revolutionary Army officers. And of course, between Bunkov and Jiron is Moda. This is the milkmaid from Lucia that we were first introduced to during Ace's cover story. Since then, we've seen her every now and then, most recently having been saved by Sabo and brought to the Revolutionary Army after the island's destruction. She expresses great concern for her lost homeland here, as we also get a reaction from Vice Admiral Komil. He was also introduced during Ace's cover story as the commander of Marine Base G2, which was located relatively near to Lelouchia. I had speculated in my 1089 breakdown that the Marines who had approached the giant hole left by its destruction were actually from G2, and it seems even more plausible now that Comil seems to have been aware of Lelouchia's destruction as well. Just who exactly knows about the Lelouchia incident is an interesting detail in this chapter. For example, we immediately see that the people of Province are unaware as we see King Elisabello and his military tactician Dagama waiting to confirm this atrocity. We last saw Elisabello during the Reverie arc, laughing about Luffy's actions, while Dagama hasn't been seen since the Dressrosa arc. As Vegapunk continues talking about the ancient weapons, we revisit what looks to be Baltimore, having just seen it a few chapters ago. The characters we saw back then are not present in this angle, though you can tell it is Baltimore due to the details of the screen as well as the mountains in the back. We had also just seen the people of Wano in the previous chapter, but here we get Momonosuke exclaiming about the Pluton with Kinemon having to silence him, causing Tama to be a bit confused. Now in the last breakdown, we talked about how Momonosuke may have been aware of Joy Boy from reading Oden's journal or even conversing with Zunisha, and here we see once again that he's aware of Pluton's existence beneath Wano, which would inform why he chose not to open the borders. Interestingly, it seems Kinemon has been entrusted with this information as well. With Pluton being the topic of discussion, we also get a brief glimpse at Crocodile. We last saw him along with the other leaders of Cross Guild earlier in this arc discussing how they'll need to amass power and resources if they wanted to bring about their utopia. Recall that Crocodile's motivation for being in Alabasta was to acquire the Pluton, and I actually love how both that panel and the one we see here are depicted with a pitch black background, almost as if calling back to that moment. It'll be interesting to see what Cross Guild's plans will be going forward, and perhaps they'll seek out the ancient weapons once again in order to build up that military power that they were looking for. Later in the chapter, Vegapunk reveals the people who know the truth about the world are the Roger Pirates, so perhaps that'll lead Crocodile and Mihawk to bullying Buggy even more for information that he doesn't have, since he and Shanks never made it to Laugh Tale with the rest of the crew. There are a ton of fun possibilities here, and last we left them, Buggy had declared his ambition to go after the One Piece, and for that, they'll need someone who can read the poneglyphs. Perhaps he'll think back to his time with Oden and seek out his family on Wano, coincidentally placing them where Pluton is as well. We'll just have to see. We then also cut to the location of the other ancient weapon, Poseidon, as we revisit Shirahoshi. We checked in with the Ryugu Kingdom just a few chapters ago, but present of course is Neptune behind Vegapunk's speech bubble, and the ministers of the right and left down here as well. We then check in on a marine ship on the ocean somewhere on the sea where it's daytime, and this is no regular battleship, as it is actually Suru's ship. We can tell from the kanji on the sail, as we first saw it during the Doflamingo and Law flashback, and last saw it approaching Dressrosa. Sengoku is aboard here, stress eating his favorite crackers. It's hard to say just how much he knows, but having been one of the older Marines on the force and the former fleet admiral, you can speculate that he knows more than the average high-ranking officer. We last saw these two earlier in this arc at Marine HQ when Hina informed them that Garp went to Fololed along with Sword, including Kujaku, Suru's granddaughter. Since then, we've speculated that these two may have made their way to Fololed in order to save Garp, and it seems that this may actually be the case. Speaking of, we also get a reaction from Sakazuki over at Marine HQ. We did see him listening to Vegapunk's message very intently a few chapters ago, and here, he seems to be angered that Vegapunk is revealing some of these secrets, but I do wonder how much he actually knows. Given that he's the Fleet Admiral, it would make sense for him to be privy to some of the details, just as the former Fleet Admiral Sengoku seems to have been, and after all, there was some suggestion that Sakazuki may be aware of a figure even above the Five Elders, as evidenced by his meeting with them toward the end of Dressrosa, but we'll just have to see. As Vegapunk reveals to the world that Roger and his crew have been aware of the world's secrets this whole time, we check back in on Crocus and Laboon, who we just saw a few chapters ago. Interestingly, we also get a reaction from the Long Arm Kingdom. Now, we did see these guys tuning into the broadcast a few chapters ago as well, but it just strikes me as curious that it's their reaction we get to see to this bit of news. Also, it seems Brook's former managers have returned to their kingdom after Brook announced his retirement from touring. We had last seen Thanklin, the one in the middle, along with the two other men angry over Brook's betrayal during the last Decks of the World cover story. There of course is another set of cameos in this chapter with Rayleigh and Shaki, but I'll address them later on in the video when discussing the Roger Pirates. Vegapunk continues his message in this chapter and goes back to talking about his first sin as he tells the world his dream of creating a source of abundant energy. He discloses his invention of the Mother Flame, but reveals that some of it was taken around 2 weeks prior to the destruction of Lelouchia, which he was then informed of. Then, he was able to predict the earthquakes that struck the world today thanks to his sensors, and because of all of this, he realized that the only thing that could cause such destruction was the power of the Mother Flame. We've been wondering why the visual component was needed for this message for weeks, and we may have part of our answer here as Vegapunk prostrates himself before the world and apologizes for his involvement in this tragedy. He states that he is not certain of who did this and why they did it, at least at the time of the recording, but continues that this further proves his idea. Vegapunk then explains that Joy Boy actually intended to leave the ancient weapons for the people to use in the future, but wonders why he would do this given the state of the world after the Void Century. It's things like this that makes it unclear for him which side is truly evil. Now let's take a step back here. Vegapunk did mention that he documented some light above Lelouch around 2 weeks after the Mother Flame was stolen, and that he was then informed the kingdom had disappeared. And as we've seen in this chapter, Lelouch's disappearance has not yet been public news, as places like Province had not heard of such a thing. The Marines to some extent were aware of this, as we saw at the start of the day when a ship was sent to check in on the remains of the kingdom, as well as with Comil's dialogue in this chapter suggesting it as well. We also know the Revolutionary Army was aware of it, as they made note of it when Sabo returned, which would make sense since Lelouch is relatively close to Kamabaka. It could be that the Revolutionary Army is who informed Vegapunk of the kingdom's disappearance. Now, Vegapunk mentioning that the Mother Flame was taken around 2 weeks before the destruction of Lelouch, which, as we know, took place 6 days ago, gives us another piece of information for the timeline, which I'll break down very briefly here. So it all starts with Luffy's first day on Wano, which we know to be March 3rd, given that it was Tama's birthday. It was also the first day of the Reverie, as the Straw Hats were reading about the previous day's news just before entering Wano, where they learned that the royals were arriving for the big 7-day meeting. We also know that it was on the 4th day of the Reverie that the revolutionaries were attacked, which would be on March 6th. We know that this took place over a month ago from present day, as seen by this Oda box when Sabo was recounting the events of the mission to Dragon and Ivankov during the first day of Egghead. So at the earliest, that day would be April 7th, with the present day being April 8th. We also know that from 1089 that the destruction of Lelouch was 6 days ago, placing that event at the earliest on April 2nd. Now, to fill in more of the context, the final day of the Reverie was on March 9th, and the raid on Onigashima was on March 17th, since it was set to take place in 2 weeks' time during the Fire Festival after Luffy's arrival. Now, after the raid, Luffy woke up about a week later on March 24th, and another day passed after the celebration. There are also a few instances of some number of days passing, so the Straw Hats left Wano around late March or early April. Now, if the Mother Flame was stolen around 2 weeks before it was used, then that puts us at around March 19th, which would be over a week before the end of the Reverie. Now, one may think that this would mean this scene where Emu expresses their desire of the Mother Flame is taking place closer to March 19th, as opposed to having taken place after the end of the Reverie around March 10th. But I think it does make sense for this conversation to have been taking place after the end of the Reverie, and for it to have just taken about a week for them to orchestrate stealing the Mother Flame from Egghead via York. Saturn does mention how they'll take the steps to make it happen, and it would make sense that the Elders requested the Mother Flames from York, rather than York just offering it to them unprompted. So, there's this rough timeline of events here for the past month or so, and there are a couple of other smaller things that happened, but for the purposes of this breakdown, this is all you really need. Now, we also find York puzzled at what Vegapunk is saying here. From her perspective, Vegapunk should not have been aware of her activities since she stopped sinking. In fact, Vegapunk did genuinely seem shocked that it was her who was doing all of this, so how would he have known about the world government's plan? And she's right, this is a pretty genuine mystery here. Now, for the record, it is possible that he knew the Mother Flame was stolen, but was not necessarily aware that it was York who did it, but even so, he took the extra steps to ensure that the transmission transponder snail was hidden away and prepared this message as well. So there are a few potential options here. Some are pretty straightforward, and some are a bit more fun. Perhaps the most simple explanation is that Vegapunk has a mole in the government that was feeding him information. After all, we know he had Stussy and CP0, so it could just simply be the case that she or some other person was able to relay the world government's plans to him. Speaking of Stussy, she and Edison continue exchanging some heartfelt words here as she asks for permission to free Kaku so he's not caught up in the bloodshed as well. Earlier in the arc, he was looking to be freed, but here his expression is a little more genuine and saddened. We also see the Seraphim and the Cypher Pole agents outside on the Fabrio phase seemingly knocked out. It appears that the entire lab itself fell out of the cloud when it was cut up by Nusjuro. Edison's words here suggest that because of this, their plan to extend the island outwards is now compromised. So the crew on the Labo phase are back to being unable to escape. One thing of note, S-Snake has been depicted with dark colored hair. This is likely the same kind of mistake that Oda had with the S-Bear earlier in this arc, before correcting his hair color to be like that of the Lunarians. Anyways, if Vegapunk had a mole in the government feeding him information on these plans, why would he be so surprised and taken aback by everything that happened over the past day or two? York mentioning that Vegapunk is not great at deception is surely meant to convey that his reactions were genuine. So, what if he knew everything, but then didn't? Now, this may sound a bit like something out of Death Note, but could Vegapunk have learned about York's betrayal and the world government's plans only to concoct a plan of his own, set it into motion, and then make himself forget? The Vegapunks all seemingly sync to Punk records to update their memory state, but what if it were possible to remove something from that system altogether? If you can delete certain bits of information from Punk records, then Vegapunk and the satellites would be none the wiser to York's betrayal. Also, S-Bear does exist. If Vegapunk didn't delete memories through Punk records, perhaps he used S-Bear to push those memories out of him and the satellites in order to forget. But why would forgetting everything even be necessary? Well, it's possible that his plan required York and the world government to not suspect a single thing. And so if Vegapunk is truly as bad at deception like York said, then this would ensure that they did not catch on to his countermeasures. For a while now, some people wondered if Vegapunk's true plan was to force all of the elders to come to Egghead in order to expose them, and while I was hesitant that he would be able to predict something like that, I will admit there is some more room opening for that sort of idea here. After all, the transmission transponder snail was designed to allow for the broadcast of a live video feed, and we've yet to really see that come into play. This is definitely an interesting wrinkle in the plot, and I'm wondering if this may allow us to revisit what exactly happened overnight before returning in 1089. There was always the possibility that something happened during that period that would come into play later on, and this could very well be it. Either way, York calls out to the elders to tell them where she now realizes Vegapunk has hit the source of the broadcast, which sort of struck me as strange that she can use her earpiece to communicate with them. It's not really a huge deal, and I guess we can just assume that they all had communicative pieces with them that allowed her to talk to them throughout this time when she plotted. But anyways, this was a theory that's been floating around the internet for a while. I've spoken with some friends about it, and I can't recall if I've ever talked about it on this channel, but there has been speculation that Vegapunk hid the transponder snail within the Iron Giant itself. This would explain what he was doing upon his introduction when he became stuck in the Iron Giant, and this does seem to be the case here, as York informs the elders that it must be protected by the robot. And finally, we get the Iron Giant in full view as it walks through the raging flames, and we've talked about how it of course resembles the ancient giants with its horns and physique, but you can really see it from this perspective here. This will surely draw the attention of the 5 elders away from the rest of the island, and hopefully allow the Straw Hats to escape. Now, the final part of Vegapunk's message talks about who in the world actually knows the entire truth, as he sheds some light on the Roger Pirates, and wonders why they didn't do anything despite having all this information. Now, given how he stated he doesn't intend on casting judgment throughout this message, I doubt he's actually accusing them of anything or thinking they're evil for holding out, especially since he himself doesn't have the full picture that they do have. It's with this that we return to the Sabaody archipelago, having last seen it just a few chapters ago. But this time, we cut to Shaki's ripoff bar and find her shaking down a pirate just as we did upon her introduction. We last saw her and Rayleigh earlier in this arc over on Amazon Lily, recuperating from the conflict that had struck there earlier between the Marines and the Blackbeard pirates. Here, however, Rayleigh seems to be in a bit of a stupor, frustrated with how much Vegapunk is revealing. The chapter ends with him telling Vegapunk not to take the fun out of this for the new generation, echoing back to what Luffy said when Usopp asked Rayleigh if he knew about the One Piece. Now, we had known since over 600 chapters ago that Roger's crew knew about everything about the world, and that he expected the younger generation to come to different conclusions when they got there on their own terms. I particularly love this ending as it reinforces the true heart of One Piece, the real-time adventure. All of the mysteries and lore drops are great, but the most compelling part of it is finding out for yourself as you go through the story. And I've spoken about this a few breakdowns ago when discussing Robin's role with regard to Vegapunk's message, but I'm glad Vegapunk doesn't have the complete picture here, as it allows Robin to seek out the true history herself, and for us to learn about the true mysteries of the world without having it spoiled by Vegapunk. And personally, I do believe that this can be taken as a bit of a statement on the spoiler and leaker culture that we as One Piece fans find ourselves in, but I won't get into my soapbox about that right here. Surely Vegapunk's message is not finished with this, but what makes me the most excited about this part is that it now forces the story to focus a bit more on the Roger Pirates. So far, the only members of the crew who we've spent some amount of time with has been Rayleigh, Crocus, Shanks, and Buggy, but there are still a ton of other crew members who are probably still out there. Scopper Caban comes to mind, so it'll be interesting to see if we get that sooner rather than later. And that's about it for everything I wanted to talk about in this breakdown. Lots of very cool little details with all of the cameos around the world, and some nice progression for the story as well. Let me know in the comments if there's anything you wanted to talk about from this chapter, and if this is your first time here, be sure to like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.